Yo, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to this week's episode of Can I Kick It FC. I'm your host, as always, Elliot Barr, and is joining me is a man from across the pond that covers all of African football, from AFCON to CAF Champions League to how Egypt is probably one of the greatest footballing countries that most people don't talk about, to how the Ghana FA is shooting themselves in the foot repeatedly, not doing things right, and everything else and all around between is Mr. I've been practicing this all week. Alasdair Howorth.
It's close enough. You
Close
call it Alasdair Ali, whatever you like. Just that guy on the other screen. I'll respond to anything. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, no problem at all, man. And I mean, trust me, this is a podcast that I've been working on for a while to make sure I have you on, because for those who don't know, you are one of the prominent voices when it comes to African football and how things are operating over there, because a lot of eyes are very Eurocentric and focused on the European game, that they forget about there's other football happening in Africa and Asia and whatnot. And you're one of those prominent voices. So I got to ask you first, how did you grow to prominence? How did you get into football? Because you're Scottish and Kenyan, right?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Why is this white guy covering African football? No, I grew up. I was born and raised in Kenya, in East Africa, and spent kind of my first 18 years there, and so that's kind of where my love of both Africa and football came from. I think for those of you not aware of Kenya, Kenya is just like although we're a terrible footballing country in terms of our performance internationally, we are a footballing mad country, and I'm sure like a lot of people kind of listening or viewing, if you have viewers in the US, kind of are used to getting up at crazy early hours to watch the Premier League, the Champions League, whatever, because of the time zone difference. Whereas for us, it was the opposite, was staying up really late, kind of watching Champions League games that kicked off at 11 p.m. or 12 at midnight. And to be a football fan out there, you've got to be passionate, and we certainly were growing up. So I think that's kind of where my love of football stemmed from, is very much kind of growing up in Kenya. We'd play football wherever and whenever we could, obviously. And then also, my family is big football family in terms of the way my dad raised me. So when I came back to the UK, as first thing is on my bucket list is to get to as many stadiums as possible and kind of jump into the football culture here as well.
So I gotta ask you this: like, did you keep up with Kenyan football at all? Like,
Kenyan football it's gone through a hard couple years. We had recently had a FIFA ban for a couple years for government interference, because our FA president was arrested for a financial scandal. So it's not been a great time. But in 2019, we qualified for the AFCON. That was the first time that I was able to see us at the AFCON, because I think we qualified once before. I think it was 2003, but I don't really remember that. So there's been some good times, there's been some bad times. Kenyan football, like a lot of other countries, has a really rich history. Is like a couple really huge clubs. Shout out kind of Gor Mahia, AFC Leopards, clubs that maybe in the 60s, 70s, 80s had huge following and kind of were really well supported. Played in some big matches across the continent in the kind of African Champions League, or the tournaments that predated that. But in recent years, it's been tough viewing, keeping up with the Kenya Premier League. To be honest, it's been a hard time. I'm not gonna lie.
No, I feel you on that, because I'm a Jamaican, so I follow Jamaican national team and whatnot, and like our league is like, unless you're on Instagram and you follow like these two guys who only seem to be the only way you can watch matches, because they'll put it on Instagram live. Like, there's no way to know like
what's going on.
It's like, yo, we are in 2024. Like, what are we doing, y'all?
Better than this.
Like, right? Like, we are literally the fifth best nation in CONCACAF. Why are we Instagramming live matches? Like, what are we doing here? It makes you just wonder, like, as a soccer journalist, it's like you feel like you're an amateur sometimes, and then you look at some of these like multi-billion-dollar federations, you're like, yo, do y'all understand what y'all do?
It is mind-blowing, the kind of the absolute incompetency that is at the heart of football, whether you right from clubs in Kenya that I keep up with, right all the way up to like Real Madrid and the Ballon d'Or ceremony, it is mind blowing how much incompetence there is for an industry that is so big. It's terrifying.
It is. It is. So let me ask you this: like, how did you get into soccer journalism, and how has that journey been for you so far?
Yeah. That's a good question, because I did not think I was going to be a journalist growing up or anything. It was not a
I don't
dream
think
of
anyone
mine.
thinks they're going to be a
Yeah,
journalist.
that's very true. Yeah, that's very true. No, I used to actually work as a community organizer. Worked in like politics in London, and then kind of realized I really hated working in politics. And was like, why don't I do something I actually enjoy, and I'll start talking and write about football. So I got a degree in journalism. And then I've kind of been covering it for since. I used to work for CNN in London. I worked in their London office for a while, and then after that, I've gone freelance. So now I do my own stuff, have my own podcasts, like my own newsletter, and write for a few other places like the BBC when I can, and kind of cover it that way. But yeah, is only 5 or 6 years or so. So it's not a long career.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I mean, when like I gotta ask this. So when covering, because I came to follow you when you were covering AFCON. Like, how is it covering a major tournament like that? Because I gotta imagine like it is exhausting.
It is the funnest and hardest thing ever, because you're working like nonstop, kind of just every single day. You're getting up, writing something, then going to a press conference, and going to a game, and going to like traveling 5 or 6 hours to get to a game. And especially in covering African football, if something inevitably goes wrong, that things are delayed, and there's a lot of chaos, but it is also the most exciting thing. I mean, like, you get paid to cover football, and you get paid to experience kind of some of the most kind of, I think, beautiful but also like uncovered cultures in the world. Like I've never been to West Africa before going to Cote d'Ivoire, and kind of just experiencing the tournament through their eyes of kind of, I did rented an Airbnb, so I was staying with someone, an Ivorian, and it kind of just experiencing the tournament through the prism of being like with Ivorians was just incredible, because that's not something you ever see when you're not covering it. I mean, like previous AFCONs I've reported on, I've covered kind of from abroad, but being on the ground, it's just it's so much fun. A lot of waiting around as well, because you have to you get to the stadium like 3 hours before the game kicks off, but you have to be careful. So I remember I think it was the final and the semi-final, both in the kind of main Olympic stadium, in Abidjan. It's kind of outside of the city, and so it's usually like a 30-minute drive without traffic. But in the build up to both the first and the last games, I think it took us like 3 hours to get through traffic, and we had to leave like 8 hours before the game even kicked off, to make sure that we were there. And so it's absolute chaos, but kind of definitely the most fun experience I've ever had.
Yeah, no, that sounds like it sounds like an elite experience. Like the World Cup is coming here. Well, the Club World Cup is coming in 2025, and then the World Cup is 2026. And I've been telling my wife, like, 2026, I'm going to a Jamaican national team game, and I am covering it. So that is like my goal, and I'm making sure that I'm preparing for that moment. So don't be surprised if like I'm hitting you up like, hey, like, I know our questions. How do I go about this?
Absolutely, man. I can't wait to be covering, being there with you in the US, covering Jamaica playing Algeria. I'm there.
It's gonna be so weird. It's gonna be so weird. So talk about African football as a whole, like the international perception of it, because it seems like it's a country, and I'll kind of throw Asia in this as well. You only really hear about them on an international level, right? We only hear about their international tournaments, how quote unquote scrappy they are, how intense the play is, things like that. How do you think African football is perceived internationally, and like, can anything be done to change the perception or anything?
Yeah, that's a huge problem with African football, is very much the way it's perceived, particularly from like kind of a Western, and kind of, I'm coming from I guess a more European focus, and I wonder if it's different in the US, but there is a massive kind of I think, a comical view of it. It's not taken seriously to the same extent as kind of European competitions. And that's kind of right from the top down, right? So you have, club chairmen and presidents who don't want to sign players or let their players go because it's in the middle of the year, and just kind of assuming that, why don't they do it in the summer? Why don't they do the AFCON in the summer? It's ridiculous that it's in January. It takes away from club football. But if you come from it from an African perspective, during the kind of Northern Hemisphere summer, right, all of North Africa is kind of roasting hot. So it's almost impossible to host a tournament. I went to the women's AFCON that was held in Morocco in June and July, and it was brutal. Like 2:00 games. I mean, well over 100 degrees. I'm trying to convert into Fahrenheit here. And just kind of brutal conditions. All of kind of Central, East, West Africa, it's rainy season. So you just can't have football tournaments during that time because the rain the storms are too big. So it kind of that restricts you if you want to host your tournaments in the Northern Hemisphere summer, essentially to a couple North African countries and South Africa. That's essentially all you can do. So we can't have it at any other time. It has to be in January. That's the one time when pretty much every African country can host it. So even, right from the top, there's a huge amount of disrespect, and even down to the coverage. Like, I remember covering it from the UK in 2021 or 2022, but the 2021 AFCON. And, initially no one even bought the rights to show it for the first, until a week before it kicked off. And even when Sky and BBC did, they didn't have any studios, they didn't have any coverage, they didn't even have commentary for some of the games. And the commentary they did have was just the token world feed that is provided. They didn't have their own people until the later rounds. And it was just really badly produced, which makes for a bad product. And so things like that is really frustrating. And I think for me, it really annoys me because, in the UK, not only do we have so much African talent playing there, you think of even, right through the years from early Premier League years, Tony Yeboah, Lucas Hadebe, these guys, all the way through to right now, Mohamed Kudus, Mohamed Salah, these guys playing so well. But also you have these massive diasporas in the UK. And it's at a time when the diaspora, and particularly the West African diaspora, is culturally kind of changing the landscape of UK culture. You think of music and and pop culture is so heavily influenced by Nigerians, by Ghanaians, and even by Somalis in East Africa. Kenyans, we're still trying to get there, but there's no kind of, the coverage is really poor. So then the AFCON is kind of left to its own devices as being it's just a meme tournament. We only share the stories that are ridiculous. And look, there are ridiculous stories, just as there are in all football. There's ridiculous. There's some crazy things that happen, like in 2021 when Gianni Sakazwe, the referee, got heat stroke and so blew 5 minutes before the full-time whistle. He went in the 85th minute. Things do happen, but I think it's the way in which it's covered is just really problematic, and massively has huge undertones of racism as well, in terms of the denigration of the product and how it's covered. So I think the way in which African football is presented is really disappointing, and I think is it definitely was better at this last tournament. I think both the tournament itself was hosted really well and the coverage was better, but it is still just got such a long way to go in terms of being taken seriously.
See, I got a question to ask you about the racism when it comes to covering African football, because I was ignorant to the fact of how much there is a disparity between Northern African football and Southern African football in terms of I think it was right around AFCON where I think I was listening to a podcast you might have been on, but how you were talking about how a lot of the money in African football is in the north, like Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, and whatnot. And how a lot of that influence shapes a lot of the decisions that happen around CAF and AFCON and things like that. Do you mind kind of diving into that a little bit more? Because that's an interesting point.
Yeah. So so historically, football obviously was introduced into the continent first initially in North Africa. You think particularly the French and English colonies, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco. So they have a really, really long history. And as does the rest of the continent. I think even Tanzania, South Africa, these countries have long histories, but football was established very early there, and football institutions were really important. You think of Al Ahly, we were kind of the Real Madrid of Africa, the ones that win the Champions League all the time and are the best on the continent. When they were initially founded in the 1910s, 1920s, it was kind of part of the resistance movement against British kind of colonial power. And so like these clubs have huge histories, and they have strong connections with like Italian football, so the culture of ultras and like football meaning more than just a team. It's not just entertainment. It has actually kind of has value beyond it. It's been something that's been really kind of connected to these clubs for a very, very long time in these institutions. And so these clubs have been kind of successful for a very long time, as have these FAs. So when you look at kind of the countries that have done really well over the decades, I mean, Egypt are Mr. AFCON. They've won the most titles. They have they had the super team in the 2000s where they won 3 AFCONs back to back to back, and have been able to produce players that a huge amount of talent. And now you've seen in the last few years, Algeria, who hadn't been doing great for maybe 20, 30, 40 years, had made comeback. Then Morocco at the World Cup. I mean, there's so many layers to it. One is kind of culturally, CAF was also dominated by these countries. I mean, you even think about the countries that actually initially made up CAF. I think it was like Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, and I think South Africa was initially involved, but then was kicked out due to the apartheid. So again, it's like all countries in Arabic speaking, aside from Ethiopia, but like North Africa. And so the kind of power has been there. Most of the FA presidents, I think up until Ahmed, a Malagasy guy in the late 2010s, all of them were North African. And so there was a real kind of focus. Whereas from kind of West Africa, you had some really strong teams, like there's back in the days, you had like Asante Kotoko from Ghana, who like built the core of the Ghanaian team that was so good in the kind of 60s and 70s. So it's not like these countries had football and the rest of Africa didn't, but you could see kind of ways in which these countries have been able to kind of build up power, I guess, in terms of the way they dominate and the way that they're run. And then in the last few years, particularly like Morocco, Egypt, and Algeria have kind of, their governments have really seen the value, more so Algeria and Morocco, of investing in football. So like Morocco, like is crazy. Like if you go there, like their training center is mind blowing. Like I went there once and they have everything. They have like a kinesthesiology lab, a dentist, like they have like 4 or 5-star hotels. Like it's like a resort, and then with like 11 world-class football pitches. So they've kind of, their countries like nationally have invested in the sport in a way that very few countries in sub-Saharan Africa have. And it kind of that, and then that investment has kind of reaped its own rewards, and as well as those countries have really strong ties with their diaspora. So as the European countries get strong as well, you see the Moroccan diaspora, the Algerian diaspora coming back to play for them in a way that you don't quite see with other countries, and a lot of other countries are catching up. But it's kind of left this where there is particularly at the club level, it's kind of the North African teams really, really dominate most of the rest of the continent.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And my other part of the question that I have for you is keeping it on African football. Like obviously, a lot of people adjust what they see from African football through social media, right? Like you said, it's kind of like people look at them as the meme association. Oh, look at this crazy tackle, or look at this guy trying to handball the ball into the back of the net. And this might be hard because you're dealing with like 50 different federations, but just as a whole, how can they use technology and social media to like change the way how African football is consumed and reported by fans?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I think that has been where actually the strides have been made, right? Is really social media, but it's also the connection between football fans in Africa, European football, but also the diaspora in Europe in particular, and the US, but in Europe in particular, because there's this, I feel like, I might be a bit wide off the mark here, but it felt like when there wasn't as much movement kind of from, particularly I think of Nigeria and Ghana into the UK, and there wasn't as strong a connection between the people, diaspora living in the UK and then back home in Nigeria and Ghana. And I mean the connection, not like in a personal, private level, but publicly, there wasn't the same kind of, because people just weren't able to express themselves publicly, because here in the UK, we're really great at silencing voices and really great at kind of sidelining people who kind of the majority didn't want to hear from. But because of social media, we've seen a much stronger connection. And because African football is so, because people in Africa are so invested in football, absolutely love football, we've seen this kind of, we've seen it definitely improving. And we've seen that in even the reporting of the AFCON is there's a much more kind of focus on TikTok. There's a much stronger focus on kind of trying to get into social media and trying to get into those kind of spheres in which, look, the mainstream kind of media isn't covering African football, even as much as it used to. The BBC, I remember chatting with the BBC guy in Africa when at the AFCON, and he was like, oh, usually we'd have a team of like 20 people here. Now we only have 3 of us, because they just don't want to cover it anymore. It's not as big a priority for them. So I think in the absence of that, that's where we've seen a lot stronger connection between like people on the continent, the diasporas, actually representing the tournaments in a way that is, I think, sometimes still a bit memey, a bit kind of, particularly when you're missing the voices that are there at the tournament or missing the voices that are there on the ground covering it. It can kind of be a bit myopic and you can miss out on the wider picture. But I think it's definitely giving a better picture of actually what the football is and what's going on. I think for me, the frustration is, particularly from the diaspora's perspective, as soon as the AFCON ends, that's where the interest disappears, and for me, I would love to see that kind of passion and interest continue throughout the year into the CAF Champions League. The Women's Champions League is kicking off this next weekend, and I would love to see interest from outside the continent and within it, the continent, to be fair, in the Women's Champions League. So I think that we got a long way to go, but there definitely is an improvement with kind of a newer generation and access to things like social media.
Yeah, I would say like here in America, like the only way you can really truly get African football is on beIN Sports.
Mm-hmm.
And beIN is notorious because they are cheap, that they will run commercials in the middle of like while the game is going on. Like nothing like it's not a picture or anything.
I've seen it. Because I'll tell you right now, here in the UK, there's a lot of African football, club football you can't get at all. And I won't say that how I access some games, but I end up watching it on beIN. And I've missed goals because of that. Like there'll be a stop and play, and then like an advert will come, and then suddenly like a team will be 1-0 up, and I'll be like, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah, and it'll take forever to get back to the goal.
Yeah,
this is like it's so bad. It's so bad. Like I remember being that. That's also how I got into football, through beIN, and to see how much beIN has like fallen off is a podcast in itself. But I digress. So the real purpose of this podcast is to talk about one of the bigger footballing countries, the Ghana FA, and everything that's going on there. So first of all, let's start off with like what are, in your opinion, what are the main challenges currently facing the Guyanese Football Association?
Whew, man, that is where to start. No, so I mean, for context, so Ghana is, despite not being one of the most populated countries in Africa, despite not being like one of the most kind of culturally, financially dominant in other areas, a country in football terms, Ghana is a huge country in African football. It's one of the African giants. They've been one of the most successful teams on the continent in terms of the AFCON. I was mentioning Asante Kotoko as a club who were one of the kind of greatest club sides in football, and they produce some of the best players, in African football history. You think of people like Abedi Pele, Andre Ayew, his son, Michael Essien, guys like that who, were playing when I got into it. But the last kind of 5-10 years has seen the kind of biggest decline in Ghanaian football. And it's heartbreaking to see. But what's kind of sparked the kind of conversation at this moment is actually the fact that, over the last 2 Africa Cup of Nations, they've had their worst ever performances. So both at the 2021 AFCON and at the most recent 2023 AFCON in January, they got knocked out in the group stages. In humiliating circumstances. In 2021, they lost to the Comoros. Now, the Comoros, for context, is a country whose entire population, I think, is like 500,000, and had never qualified for a tournament before, and they knocked Ghana out. And then this last AFCON, they drew with it was Cabo Verde, again, another minuscule island nation, as well as drawing with Mozambique that kind of made them lose. And then off the back of that, their 2 worst ever AFCON performances going into qualifying for this next AFCON that'll happen next year. They are now on the verge of being knocked out. And they're in a group with Angola and Sudan, who are the 2 teams that are going to knock them out. And this happened off the back of Sudan beating them at the last round of qualifiers. And so it now leaves Ghana in a position where, unless they win both games and Sudan lose both games in their final qualifiers, which is tremendously unlikely because Ghana have only got 2 points from 4 games so far and still have to play Angola in Angola, essentially Ghana are not going to be at the next AFCON. And that is unthinkable, kind of even 5 years ago, the idea that that's happened. Now, a lot of the problems, and you got in touch with me after I was tweeting about the current Ghana president, Kurt Okraku, because he was filmed kind of lambasting the team ahead of their crunch game against Sudan, talking about, you have to represent the country with pride. Like, if you don't win, this is an embarrassment. And I was, I just thought it was outrageous that the FA president will be coming in, cutting into the team to tell them how bad they've been and how they need to kind of buck up their ideas, when, it's not just this team that's failed under him. It's every team in the last 5 years of his tenure has failed. And he's an administrator, he's not the coach. He's not there to give them information on how to play. And is just kind of a man who is trying to deflect from his own failures as a president, to kind of, essentially blame the players. And so I think there's huge problems in Ghana, kind of footballing wise, infrastructurally. There's very few development paths. I think Ghana have kind of been bailed out by the Right to Dream Academy, which is like the famous big academy that's been set up there, 10 to 20 years ago, and has kind of produced players like Mohamed Kudus, Ernest Nuama, kind of some of the best Ghanaian players coming through. But outside of the Right to Dream Academy and 1 or 2 other smaller ones, there's very little development. There's very little access for players to kind of train and get better. Ghana clearly don't have a strategy for bringing in diaspora players. We're talking about the importance, successful African teams are built off 2 things: developing players locally and bringing in your diaspora. And it's very rare, I think, probably since Egypt last won the AFCON, that, or maybe Zambia in 2012, that a team has not had both of those elements has been successful. And their recruitment strategy for bringing in the diaspora is just super like scattergun. So for comparison, Morocco, they've got the Moroccan Federation has an entire team that's dedicated to finding every single Moroccan-born person or someone who's eligible to play for Morocco playing in Europe right from the age of like 8. They have an entire database of every single person. And as soon as they identify someone, they're reaching out to their family. They're getting in touch. They're trying to build relationships. And that's why someone like Ashraf Hakimi, came through at Real Madrid, now plays at PSG, arguably the best right back in the world. Even when he was 18, 19, when he won the Champions League with Real Madrid, he was draping a Moroccan flag over himself and not a Spanish one. And he wanted to play for Morocco because even though he grew up in Spain, he always wanted to play for Morocco because Morocco had been doing that work. Whereas Ghana, there's none of that. It's so kind of like, okay, let's see which English Ghanaian guys didn't make the England team. And then we'll reach out to them and see if we can get them in. Oh, can we get a former player to try and convince a player? Someone like Callum Hudson-Odoi, has a couple caps for England, is still eligible, I think, to switch nationality, move to Ghana. They should have been speaking to Callum Hudson-Odoi when he was 12, 11, 13, whatever. But there's nothing of that. So on both fronts, they don't have any development. They don't have any development locally. They don't have any development bringing players in from the diaspora. The Ghanaian league is constantly hit by scandals, betting scandals. There was a huge one, I think it was 2018, when there was a huge expose of like bribery scandals to referees, players, etc. Obviously COVID hit them hard, as it did every league, but there's so little investment in the Ghanaian Football League, and there's just no kind of investment in other structure. I think about the women's team. One of the things that Ghana did so well was the Black Queens, the women's national team, who for decades were the only team that could keep up with Nigeria. For context, like Nigerian women's football team just smashes AFCON all the way up until 2019. From 1991, they've been the dominant force, and the only team that can compete with them is Ghana. Last 5 years, Ghana fell off a cliff. Didn't even qualify for the women's AFCON in 2022. In fact, the under-17s team is currently not even allowed to play because they're facing a ban for fielding overage players. And it's
Oh
like
my
that
God.
that comes down onto the president. That comes down onto, the people who are running this. It's not the players' fault. It's not, it's the structure. And so I think, Ghana football is at its lowest point in kind of every sense of it. They don't have any teams in club competitions who qualify for the Champions League or the Confederations Cup, which is the African equivalent of the Europa League. So yeah, it's right from top to the bottom. Ghana football is just kind of an absolute mess.
That wow.
Yeah,
That is a
there's
complete.
so
I
much.
understand why you said there was a lot to dive into, because I want to ask you this, because you really hit a good point about like the corruption and the governance and how much that hinders the growth and development of football in Ghana. But then like on the flip side of that, of like how does that messes with the relationship with the fans of Ghana football, because they're like some of the most passionate fans I've
Yeah,
ever seen.
100%. I'll
Like
tell
how
you,
does that mess with them?
one of the craziest experiences I've ever had was going into the post-match press conference of, it wasn't even was it the last game? I think it was the last game, the game they drew 2-2 with Mozambique, the final round of the group stage in the AFCON, and the journalists sitting in the room, they just were out for blood for Chris Hughton and his players. And like, I've never seen such unprofessionalism from journalists, but it's because it means so much to them. And they were screaming at him, like the press conference had to be ended early. And then when the players came out, and, it's like how it works is there's like a mix zone. So it's like, it's kind of a bit weird, but it's like, you've got this barrier blocking the journalists, and the players have to walk past, and you kind of try and get their attention. And if they want to speak to you, they'll come over, and there'll be a big rush to like everyone get their microphones in front of the player and ask him questions. But obviously the Ghanaians just had the most humiliating result, drawing with Mozambique, getting up to the AFCON. So none of them are speaking to them. One or two journalists actually like grab players, like trying to force them to speak to them. And like, look, yes, I think the Ghanaian players should front up and should explain why they lost, should kind of hold their heads high, blah, 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 and speak to the media. But like the way they were treated was just horrible. And I think it kind of represents like a huge kind of disconnect between the team and the fans. Is like, there's so much anger, and there's so much kind of lack of faith in a sense of the system. Like the journalists, the fans, they know that it's not a well-run system. They know it's not a well-run team. And so there's no good faith. There's no, oh, we lost at the AFCON, we had a humiliating result, but there's positives, players can hold their heads high, there's just pure animosity. And so I think, yeah, it's really damaged the kind of relationship between the players and the fans. And it'll be really interesting to see in the final qualifiers, particularly the ones at home, how they'll be received, because like you said, Ghanaian fans are some of the most kind of brilliant fans there are. So passionate, they support their team through thick and thin. But I think there's kind of been a real almost betrayal from the FA and from the team there. So it's definitely soured the relationship. And again, that relationship is at an all-time low. And this is crazy thinking, because just 2 years ago they played in the World Cup.
Yeah.
And like they did well. They got knocked out in the group, but South Korea they beat. They pushed Portugal, almost got a draw with them, lost 3-2 in that amazing game. So it is just remarkable how quickly it's kind of fallen apart. And it also goes to show that World Cup qualification, I think a lot of the FA and people like that hung their hat on it and said, look, we're doing well, we qualified for the World Cup. But it just papered over the cracks, because they shouldn't have qualified for the World Cup. In the final round of in the group stage round of qualifying, they needed to get a win in their final group game, and they got a massively, wildly offsides goal that got them through ahead of South Africa. And then they played Nigeria, were outplayed over 2 legs, because you have to play a playoff in African football for World Cups. Nigeria were the better side by far, but they drew 0-0 in the first game, and then Thomas Partey scored a really good goal in the second, and that was it. Like they didn't really deserve to be at the World Cup, so it papered over those cracks. And look, that's unfair of me. They did deserve it. They got the results they needed, but it just didn't address any of the issues, and that's why I think there's a lot of bad blood between the fans and the FA.
Yeah, I mean, Oh man, it just seems like there's a bunch of chaos pulling everyone in different directions. Everyone's just like, where is it coming from? Because we're talking about a
Absolutely.
country that was like 2010. They were like
Yeah, on the
literally,
verge of a semifinal. Yeah,
yeah. And now we're talking about them missing out on national tournaments on all fronts, just not on the men's level, but women's,
yeah.
youth,
and and
and
and it's and again, I yes, I think they haven't provided the play. They haven't quite developed the same level of players, but
yeah,
you look at that front line for them. You have Yanaki Williams, constantly a great goal getter in Spain for Athletic Bilbao. You have Antoine Semenyo at Bournemouth, who just tore Kyle Walker a new one over the weekend when Bournemouth beat Man City. Amazing player, can play anywhere on the front three, kind of so strong, so powerful, like can win games on his own, incredible player. And you've got Mohamed Kudus, who I think is the heir to Mohamed Salah's throne as the best player in Africa. Like he's so good, Mohamed Kudus. And players like Ernest Nuama on the wing. Like there is such a good team there. So it's not just that the players aren't being produced. It's a systemic kind of rot, and it's really disappointing.
so I mean, we talked about the media and how they got, like you said, there was some unprofessional moves, but you can understand like the passion of it. Does the Ghana FA has any goodwill with the media there? Like, did he have anyone that's like, hey, things might look bad on the pitch, but they're trying. Like, is there any goodwill there at all?
A little bit, not much, and it's slipping away. But I mean, I think, and again, to me, it kind of, I don't see how there can be much goodwill in the media
Yeah,
aside from saying that Kurt Okraku, the president, used to be a journalist, used to work in the media. So I think there's, he has friends in the media who will still defend the team, defend the kind of way in which the FA has been run. But I mean, even you just look at on Twitter and Google, Ghana FA, you'll come up with a string of, Ghanaian TV reports or articles, and it's nothing. None of it is good news. None of it is good
wow.
news. And so I think even in the media sense, there is the pressure is told, and the patience is running out.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I definitely can imagine that. I can feel it. Like, and let me ask you this because I think you will probably have the best perspective on it. I've only seen it, I've had touched it or been there to really understand it. But do you feel like these challenges in Ghana reflect a broader issue in African football as a whole?
100%.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of other countries that have been super reliant on luck in terms of the players they've been able to get in, or coaches. I think Nigeria is a great example, who a team that has not been well run, similar to Ghana, kind of pretty incompetent FA. The difference is Nigeria kind of have a much bigger diaspora and have and then also have some superstars to pick from, like Victor Osimhen. We've seen Ademola Lookman come 14th in the Ballon d'Or. But I think they've gotten one or two things right that Ghana hasn't. But in terms of internal infrastructure and development, it's lacking. And this is the thing, is that what I kind of love about African football is because a lot of these big countries are really stalling out, like Nigeria, like Ghana, I think like Tunisia.
Yeah,
It really leaves open if you are an FA that is well run and does things right, you will be successful. And that's why I think over the last few years, we've seen some of these tiny nations. I mentioned the Comoros, I mentioned Cabo Verde. These countries have no right to even be at the AFCON, let alone kind of be performing.
I'm working. Sorry, my
No, you're
mom.
good.
Give me 1 second, please. Just give me
No, you're
1 second.
good. African football at a national level, the club game is different. Is that because a lot of these big countries are really struggling and haven't quite learned how to come into the modern era, is that if you're a well-run nation, you will see success. And I think that's why we see a lot of these really small or middle-sized African countries just punching above their weight constantly. So I think Comoros and Cabo Verde that I mentioned, they have no right to be at the AFCON, no right. And yet Cabo Verde twice got past the group stage in the last two AFCONs. Comoros qualified for their first ever tournament and will likely qualify for this one. Even you look at Sudan. Sudan is a nation that is literally under civil war.
Yeah.
The national team has been based out of Saudi Arabia. Have been playing their home matches in Libya or South Sudan. Their two biggest clubs, Al Hilal and Al Merrikh, are playing in the Mauritanian League, so on the west coast of Africa, and yet they're the ones that are knocking out Ghana. Because they're getting things right. They're hiring the right people, and ironically, they've hired a Ghanaian coach, Kwesi Appiah, who's doing very well. And Equatorial Guinea, they're a good example of actually maybe an exception to what I was saying about you have to have this balance of diaspora and non-diaspora, because they have a team almost exclusively of players who are from the Equatorial Guinean diaspora in Spain, but they've been able
the FA to have the guy that just got suspended.
Yeah,
that's okay. But he was lighting it up. Like, I think he's like a right back in third division Spain. But
yeah, Emilio Nsue, amazing story.
Okay.
Like, yeah, born in Mallorca in the Spanish island to Equatorial Guinean parents, played at Mallorca, was a center forward, and then over his years was turned into a winger and then a right back. So played as a right back in England from Middlesbrough, Birmingham, one or two other places, and then has been playing right back in the third division of Spain. And yet for Equatorial Guinea, plays center forward and is amazing. He won the top goal scorer award at the most recent AFCON. He scores all their goals. Like, it's amazing. I interviewed him when I was at the AFCON, and he's just like remarkable to hear. Like, yeah, this crazy, like, a right back is somehow playing center forward. But they're an example that, the FA isn't terribly well run in many ways, but they've got this one thing right. They've got the national team right. Yeah. They've managed it super well. They've got a great coach who used to be a part of the team and then went to Europe, got his coaching licenses. So that's what I love about African football, is that if you run your country well, run your national team well, you will see success. And it's the same because these teams like Nigeria, like Ghana, are kind of stalling out, which is a huge shame, because these countries should be being at every World Cup, should be reaching the latter stages of the AFCON. But both of those teams have done one or the other. Ghana got to the World Cup, Nigeria got to the last AFCON final. But it's all almost in spite of the FA. Nigeria coming into the tournament, everyone hated their coach. There was no kind of optimism, but it's because of what Jose Peseiro, their coach, did super well, that they got to the final being kind of boring, defensively solid, and looking to Lookman and Osimhen to kind of be the creativity up front and get the goals. But off the back of that, they weren't able to convince him to stay because it was such a poorly run team. So now they're back to having their coach, who was the interim coach from like 3 years ago. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of countries that are really badly run in terms of their FA in Africa. There's some that are really well run. Shout out, to ones like Senegal, like Morocco, like Algeria. And that's why those are the countries that are seeing huge success, because they are well run.
So for all the dumping, I guess we've done on Ghana, which is rightfully deserved, because they earned it. Are there any positives for fans to look forward to, or supporters to look forward to?
Yeah, so I guess the positives are a couple things. From the men's side, right, you have the Right to Dream Academy in Ghana, which is one of the best academies in the world, certainly in Africa, which is producing these incredible talents like Mohamed Kudus. So there is so much talent there, and there is the kind of framework for building academies, for building that kind of development structure to bring through the players. Not only that, they do have an amazing diaspora of players. You think of some of the players who haven't, players like who are playing for other European countries that could have played for them, like Jeremy Doku, is Ghanaian. You think of, I don't know, like even Eddie Nketiah still could potentially play for them. So there's kind of the building blocks there. And it's just about hiring the right people. And we've seen that on the women's side. They hired a Swiss coach, Nora Hapital, who's come in and has done brilliant work. I think they went 12 games unbeaten under her. They, came pretty close to qualifying for the Olympics. They only lost to Zambia, who Barbara Banda, one of the best players in the world, scored against them, and that can happen to anyone because she's just amazing. But they're now a well-coached team, and what the FA has done well with her is, although they haven't done any of the work, they've given her the license to do the work. So she spends every week in Turkey or Germany or Sweden, visiting players, visiting diaspora players, trying to convince them to play for Ghana. So like they've hired the right person there. From the men's side, it's hard to find the positives, I'm not gonna lie, because they're not doing well in World Cup qualification. They're almost definitely not going to qualify for the AFCON. And so that kind of leaves them in a position where they've got almost 3 years of nothing now until then the AFCON after the World Cup. But like I said, the building blocks are there. So if they can, and they kind of were almost onto something when they initially brought in Chris Hughton, brilliant coach, obviously in England with Ghanaian roots. As a technical director, they had Otto Addo, who's kind of taken charge, who was a great coach at Dortmund, but has kind of just been thrown into it and hasn't done well. So I think there's the building blocks there where it's like, if they started to get these things right structurally, infrastructure, if they start thinking ahead of time, they can build. But it's kind of one of those things, kind of like I think of, like Germany in the early 2000s or England maybe 15 years ago, like it's going to take a reset. It's going to take a huge reset and they won't see the results for 5-10 years. And you have to have that kind of mindset. But there are the building blocks there for Ghana to be an AFCON winning country because, they have the talent.
Yeah, it's just making sure they put the right things in place. And can they be patient enough?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the hard thing is making the right decisions and sticking with them. Although at this point, if they made any right decisions, that's the place to start.
That is fair. That is totally fair. There was one more question I wanted to ask you before we kind of start to wrap things up, but like, and once again, I rely on your expertise of being a reporter of African football, but like, in what ways do you think football reflects the cultural and social dynamics of Ghana? Like, how does that, and overall, like, how do you go about reporting things in different countries? Do you have to change the way how you report things in versus Morocco than you do in Egypt or like in South Africa? Like, do you have
That's a
to
really good
change and
question.
report things?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, every country has its own challenges and dynamics, like, in terms of who can you speak to, how much press freedom is there, like even simple things like that in terms of actual like journalistic reporting. I think in terms of the way Ghana represents culture, I think football and African football generally, but particularly kind of sub-Saharan football, African football, and especially kind of, again, with the kind of racial element, Black athletes, is it really does represent a lot of cultural aspects. And I think particularly in terms of like relationship to like power, like part of this is all Ghana's fault, right? Like the federation is badly run, but it's also the institutions of football and wider society that pushes Ghana and Ghanaian footballers into these positions. So, let's think of it in terms of football perspective, wide lens football perspective. Football is a money-driven industry, as are all sports. And so what does football as a money-driven industry want from Ghana? They don't want Ghana to be successful. They don't want Ghana to be well run. They don't want the infrastructure there. What they want are good Ghanaian players, because you can take those Ghanaian players to the Premier League and they'll light up the Premier League. You could take them to France and they'll light up France. And so in many ways, just in the same way that there's exploitative industries extracting things like cocoa or gold or whatever it is from Ghana, I think football is the exact same. And it's the exact same across Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. There is no interest in development. There's no interest in actual like talent. There's only interest in the raw product material that can then be developed elsewhere. And by that being developed elsewhere also means that the proceeds go elsewhere. And, Mohamed Kudus being amazing for West Ham, he's not making Ghana any money. That's not kind of going back into Ghanaian football. That money is going into the pockets of West Ham, of Ajax, who they bought him from. It's reflective of football as an institution as a wider institution. But I think, and it's really sad because then it means that, and this is a huge problem where I come from in Kenya, is that for Kenyans, then there's that similar motivation, right? Because Kenyans look at the Kenya Premier League and say, like Kenya Premier League is badly run, it's corrupt, da 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 da. But there's no incentive to kind of fix it because, we can watch the Premier League. We can watch the best football there is. We don't have to watch Kenyan football. And, even occasionally we'll get a Kenyan there, Victor Wanyama, who played in the Premier League, and that's amazing. But it's really hard then to fight against that because the money's not there, and the kind of infrastructure of wider football, wider society doesn't want Kenya to be interested in Kenyan football. They want it to be interested in the Premier League because that's what'll make the money. So I do think football in many ways, both kind of culturally and power dynamics wise, really does reflect society. And it is, it's hard to see and it's sad to see. But it's in many ways it is. And again, it's not hopeless. I think there's some countries that have been really resistant to that. Like Tanzania is a great example. I was there a few months ago, and like the passion for Tanzanian football in Tanzania is incredible. It's amazing. I went to the Dar es Salaam derby between Yanga and Simba, and like 60,000 fans are there in the stadium. Like it's amazing. So there are examples. That's not like a hopeless situation, but you're working against the tide of kind of how the world works, and the tide of wider kind of culture and society. Yeah. So in that sense, I think football is like a perfect mirror for it in many ways.
Wow. Well, yeah, man. And whew. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's a lot. It was a heavy question to finish with.
No, I mean, that's a lot, man. But as we start to wrap up this podcast, man, I want to ask you this question because I think a lot of our conversation, granted, it's been on Ghana and Africa, whatever, but just like putting more of that coverage on African football and doing what isn't in the norm. Because it's very easy to, cover European football and have all the access and all the stats and all the cool videos. But, doing something off the beaten path. So to any aspiring young journalist or anyone looking to get into journalism and football, like, what advice would you give them breaking into it? And two, how would they do well in covering African football?
That's a hard one. I mean, journalism now is not the time to be getting into it. It's an industry that is falling apart. There's less and less money in it. It's hard. So I would say, first of all, be realistic because it's tough. It's a tough gig. Yeah. It's like, and a lot of it is just, sadly, you're reliant on luck, on connections, on, getting that break and taking it. And yeah, you have to work hard and seize that opportunity. In terms of particularly sports journalists, like, yeah, if I was someone doing sports journalism now, entering it, and even the way I approach it is don't cover the Premier League, don't cover the Champions League. Everyone is doing that. Yeah. And so you are not going to get a big slice of that pie, kind of. That's what we were talking about off air before we started recording, how like, you were covering your local team in Richmond. And like, I think that's where it's got to be. Like, make yourself an expert on these smaller fields. And then when those things start to grow, you'll get a huge, I mean, imagine being like someone who covered, and I don't know how this has panned out. You probably have much better, experience than me, but someone who covered, say, Inter Miami five years ago when the team was just being formed and like covering local football, you're in a position that when Messi comes to town, you actually have the expertise and the experience to say, like, this is actually what football means in Miami, whatever it is. And so I'd say if you're particularly getting into sports journalism, yet don't cover the big stuff, like, because it's so easy to be an expert on the Premier League. We all are, because we all watch it, we all love it, but the chances of you being able to break into that, or if you do cover it in a weird way, cover it differently. For me, again, a huge one, women's sports, women's football, like, and especially in the US, like the NWSL is amazing. You've got so many new, players coming into it, new franchise teams like, Bay City, Angel City is really interesting. And women's football is just like exploding everywhere. Even like Mexico, so many African players playing in Mexico now. Even here in the UK, the WSL is growing. Even here in Scotland, I watched the Edinburgh Derby a couple of days ago in the stadium. It was great. Like, so I think finding those niches is so important because the big stuff, everyone can cover those. Like you can learn to cover those with your kind of eyes closed. But it's the kind of when you get into the niche stuff that's you kind of show your value, I guess. I think that's the biggest thing I'd say. What was the other question? Sorry, I got focused.
No. I mean, I was listening to you. No, just like how.
Oh, about African football.
Yeah, about African.
I just like take interest. Like that's the biggest thing. There's so many amazing clubs and countries and interesting stories, like, that you can kind of get invested in and figuring out ways to not just consume it from the way in which it might be shown on your news feeds or your, Twitter or X or whatever, TikTok, like actually trying to find out about those clubs and find out how you can watch. So, you know, in the US, yeah, you can watch all the CAF Champions League football games on BN. That's awesome. Like in the UK, we literally do not have a way to watch it, like through mainstream ways. And then, you know, you can cover other kind of aspects of it, like Women's Champions League. I think that's going to be free to watch on YouTube, like every single game. That's awesome to be able to kind of cover that. And so I think that's like great ways to step in. And then, you know, you kind of touched on it earlier, but the Club World Cup is coming to town in the US. Yes, it's a kind of much maligned tournament, and I think it's kind of in many ways just a cash cow for FIFA. But it is also an awesome tournament. And in the US, you will get to see some of these really interesting clubs coming from around the world, like Al Ahly, like Wydad, like Esperance, like Mamelodi Sundowns, the 4 teams coming from Africa. Countries, you know, some of those clubs I already talked about, Al Ahly, and having a history of, you know, being revolutionaries and being, you know, these fan-owned clubs. You know, Al Ahly is, you know, I think is in the top 20 clubs with the biggest social media followings in the world. You know, but you wouldn't even know that. But that's how big a club this is in the Arab world, in North Africa, and you're going to be able to watch it in the US. So I think kind of learning about these clubs, I just like, for me, that's what I love. It's learning about the niche stuff. It's learning about these kind of smaller teams that are really fascinating and kind of getting to experience them. But yeah, it's a hard one because, again, because it's niche, there's less interest, there's less money, there's less kind of stuff like that. So it is tricky. But yeah, I think African football is only growing, and I think interest in it is only growing. So I think you need to get aboard that hype train, is what I would say.
Yeah, honestly, it does need it, and you know, we can play a part in covering that. We can play
absolutely, and I think from your perspective, it's probably the same with like Jamaica and the Caribbean. You know, with like some of these diaspora guys coming to play for Jamaica, like Miguel Antonio, like guys like that. Like, there's so much more interest in it than there would have been 5-10 years ago. And it's about like, how do you capitalize on that? How do you start showing that, you know, if Jamaica gets the World Cup, you know, like, which they probably should, like, how awesome would be that, you know, covering that, reporting that. I think like, it's not just an African thing. I think there's other parts of the world where we're kind of realizing, oh wait, like there's sport here, there's football here. It's like, and you know, it's cool, and it's has its own character, even if, you know, you have to watch it on a Instagram live stream, whatever, like stuff like that. It's, yeah, you got to embrace the kind of mayhem.
Yeah, the craziness behind it, man, and whatnot. But man, Ali, I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day for hopping on this podcast, man. This has been one of the more fun and informative pods I've done in a long time, and I couldn't have done it without you.
Nah, it's been a joy. I've loved it. I'll talk about African football all day long. I love it.
I love it, man. I love it when, you know, you can get someone on the pod where you can just talk to them and you throw them a question and you just like, you can see their eyes over the passion flows through. I love it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, where can listeners reach out to you and follow some of your great work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm trying to figure that out myself. I posted my first TikTok the other day, and it was horrible and cringy and suffering experience. No, I mean, in terms of social media, I've been quite quiet actually the last kind of year, but I'm trying to ramp it up again, doing stuff. You can find me on Twitter. In terms of my own content, I share all my content there. But in terms of the stuff that I do, I co-host a African football podcast. So if you are interested in African football, I co-host a podcast called the On the Whistle podcast, where we kind of talk, you know, we chat like this oftentimes, but we also do loads of interviews. This week we've got a couple interviews going out with the South African women's head coach Desiree Ellis, and we've kind of done some interviews with some of the biggest names in African football, like, I don't know, Benny McCarthy, Kanu. We even had Javi Alonso on once many years ago. But also we try and promote some of the smallest names in kind of football and in African football, as well as then I have my own Substack. It's under the same name, On the Whistle, my newsletter. You can subscribe to that for free, and kind of get that bi-weekly newsletter from me talking about whatever African football is topical at the time.
Yeah. Well, man, everyone go support him. He's a great journalist, someone that I look up to and aspire to be like one day. But with that being said, listeners, we just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day for listening to our show. And with that being said, we will holler at you guys next time. Be easy and be safe.